In the spring of 1883, a woman rode into Custer County, Montana Territory, on the back of a borrowed mule and stopped at the top of a ridge to look at what she had inherited. The land ran 320 acres down from that ridge into a wide, shallow valley, broken by a frozen creek that had not yet fully thawed, with a log cabin at its center and a hay barn that leaned a degree and a half to the west. There were 51 cattle visible in the far pasture, though the will had promised 60. The fence along the north edge was down in 2 places. The cabin had 1 window facing east, and the glass in it was cracked at the lower corner. She sat on the mule for a long time and looked at all of it. Her name was Roberta Holloway, and she had gone by Bo since she was 9 years old and had told her mother she would not answer to anything longer. She was 31 years in the spring of that year, unmarried, formerly employed as a ledger clerk for a dry goods concern in St. Louis that had not survived the preceding winter, and she had come to Custer County because her Uncle Clem had left her his ranch in his will, and because she had no particular reason to stay in St. Louis once the ledger work ran out. Clem Holloway had died in February of 1883, quietly in the same cabin she was now looking down at from the ridge, and had left 2 things behind besides the ranch itself: a deed made out in her name, and a letter folded 3 times and sealed with a dab of candle wax. She had read the letter in a law office in Miles City the morning before riding out to the property. The lawyer, a thin man named Prentice, had slid it across his desk with the deed and watched her face while she opened it. Clem's handwriting was a careful, deliberate hand, the kind a man learns late in life after deciding it matters. He had written that the ranch was 320 acres in Custer County, that the herd ran at 60 head, that the hay barn held enough through a mild winter if the hay came in full. He had written that he was proud of her and had always been proud of her, and that he was leaving the land to her because she was the only Holloway he knew who would not sell it for the first price offered. And then, at the bottom of the letter, he had written the warning. He had written that Montana winters were not what she would expect from any description she had read or any story she had heard, that the cold in November could close a valley for weeks at a time, that cattle died in numbers that would astonish a person who had not seen it, and that if she found herself in late September with the hay short and the herd thin, she should sell the land before the first hard freeze and come home with something in her pocket rather than nothing. Bo had folded the letter exactly as it had been folded before, tucked it into the inside breast pocket of her coat, and thanked the lawyer for his time. She did not sell. Pepper was the mule's name. He had belonged to Clem, and the lawyer had said she could take him from the livery as part of the estate. He was a gray mule, 14 hands with a wide, flat forehead, and the disposition of a man who has heard every argument and found none of them convincing. He stood steady under her on the ridge, ears turning toward the cattle in the far pasture, unconcerned by the cold, or the broken fence, or the leaning barn. Bo put her heels to him and they rode down. The cabin was small inside and clean. Clem had been a neat man. There was a cast-iron stove, a pine table with 2 chairs, a narrow bunk along the north wall, and a shelf above the stove that held a Bible, a copy of Farmers and Stockmen's Almanac for 1882, and 3 small tins she later discovered held salt, baking soda, and a quantity of dried sage that smelled of the whole valley every time she opened the lid. The cracked window let in a thin whistle of wind that she stopped that first night by pressing a strip of cotton batting into the gap. She made a fire, made coffee, ate biscuits she had bought in Miles City, and sat at the pine table in the lamplight reading the almanac until her eyes would not stay open. She was not afraid. She was something more useful than afraid. She was paying attention, The first person in Custer County to address Bo directly with an opinion about her prospects was Walt Greer, who ran the feed merchants on the main road through town, a long, low building that smelled of grain dust and saddle oil and the particular dry cold of a Montana spring. She rode Pepper into town in the first week of June, tied him at the post, and went in to establish an account. Walt was a broad man in his late 50s with a gray beard and the habit of resting both hands flat on his counter when he was thinking carefully about something. He listened to her explain what she needed, looked at the deed she set in front of him, and then told her plainly that he had known Clem Holloway for 11 years and that he respected the man's memory, but that a ranch of 320 acres with a herd to winter was not a proposition he had ever seen a woman manage alone, and that she might do better to find a buyer before summer was out, while the land was still in condition to fetch something decent. Bo picked the deed up from his counter, folded it, and put it back in her coat pocket beside the letter. She told him she would need an account for grain and hay supplement, that she intended to pay at the end of each season, and that if he preferred not to extend credit, she would ride to Miles City to establish her account there. Walt was quiet for a moment. He wrote her name in his ledger. He extended the credit. He also, she noticed, wrote a note beside her name in pencil that she did not ask to read. The woman who told her what the note likely said was Dora Voas, who owned the neighboring section to the east and had been running it alone since her husband Harlan died of a lung fever 2 winters prior. Dora was a compact, deliberate woman in her 40s, with broad hands and a direct gaze, and a reputation in town that Bo gathered was not entirely warm. The women of the Methodist congregation found Dora insufficiently grieving. The men on the town council found her insufficiently deferential. She had at some point declined to sell her eastern section to a buyer who had wanted both her land and Clem's, and the refusal had not been forgotten. When Bo rode over to the Voss property one afternoon in mid-June to introduce herself and look at the fence line they shared, Dora was in her barn working on a harness, and she looked up from her work and said that she had heard about Bo from 3 separate people in town, and that all 3 had said the same thing. Bo asked what they had said. Dora said they had said it would not last through September. Bo said September seemed a long way off. Dora looked at her for a moment, and then at Pepper, and then back at her. She set down the harness and said she would put coffee on. That was the start of it. Dora knew Custer County cattle, and she knew Custer County winters, and she knew which sections of the creek froze hard early, and which ran open longer, and which pasture sheltered, and which ones funneled the wind. She shared this knowledge the way she shared everything, without ceremony, as a fact useful to another person who was clearly paying attention. Bo listened and remembered everything. Through June and July, she learned the land by working it. She walked every fence line and noted every down post and every section of wire gone slack. She repaired the 2 down sections on the north edge first, because Dora told her the north wind in October would scatter a herd through a gap in the north fence before a woman could get her boots on. She cut and stacked the first hay yield from the lower meadow in July, working from first light until the light went, loading the hand scythe in long strokes across the dry grass. Pepper pulled the loaded sled to the barn, reliable and indifferent to the heat. She came inside each evening with her hands wrapped in cloth and her forearms aching, and ate whatever she had left on the stove and was asleep before the lamp burned down. She had expected the work to be hard. It was harder than that. Her hands, which had spent years managing a ledger pen and an ink pot, opened and bled at the palms through the first 2 weeks, and then calloused over and stopped complaining. She learned to read the sky in the morning before deciding how far from the cabin to ride that day. She learned which of the 51 cattle were stubborn and which were followers, and which one old roan cow had to be moved first if you wanted the rest to follow without trouble. She named the roan cow Agnes, which felt appropriate. If you have ever watched a person learn a hard place rather than merely endure it, you know the particular quality of attention they carry, the way everything they see becomes information and nothing is wasted on complaint. Bo had that quality. She had probably always had it. In late July, Walt Greer stopped by the ranch with a delivery she had not ordered. He pulled his wagon up to the barn, climbed down with considerable ceremony, and stood looking at the hay she had already stacked. He said it was a reasonable stack. She thanked him. He said he had brought an extra 50 pounds of salt block she had not paid for, that he was leaving it as part of her account to be settled later, and that he supposed she knew what she was doing with salt block. She said she supposed she did. He climbed back on his wagon and left without saying anything about selling. She noted that too. What neither of them yet said aloud was that the hay yield from the lower meadow had come in short. She had cut and stacked everything the meadow offered through July, and when she walked it in the first week of August and looked at what remained and calculated what 51 head of cattle would need from November through March, the numbers did not close. The meadow had given her a thin grass year, which Dora told her was not unusual after a dry spring, and the upper pasture had given her less than Clem's almanac notes suggested it typically yielded. She had enough for a mild winter. Montana Territory did not specialize in mild winters. She walked the numbers every morning for a week before she admitted what she already knew. The herd was also wrong. The will had stated 60 head. She had 51. She had counted 3 separate times across 3 different mornings, and the number was always 51. She rode back into Miles City in mid-August and looked at the inventory Clem's will had been drawn from, and the lawyer Prentice told her, not unkindly, that Clem had written the will from memory 18 months before his death, and that no official count had ever been taken. 9 head of cattle had either died, strayed, or been sold in the interval, and there was no record of which. The land was still 320 acres. The deed was clean. But the herd she had ridden out to manage in June was not the herd the will had described, and the hay she had cut for 60 was being asked to cover 51 through a winter that Clem himself had warned her about. She rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, with Pepper moving at his usual steady pace and the numbers sitting in her chest like a stone. She fed Clem's cattle, filled the water trough, and sat at the pine table in the lamplight looking at what she had written in a small notebook she had bought in Miles City for the purpose of keeping her own accounts. The feed debt she needed to carry 51 head through a hard winter, supplementing what the hay covered, came to $180. She had $40 in cash from the last of her St. Louis savings. She had a deed with 320 acres behind it. She had sworn to herself on the ridge in May, looking down at the leaning barn and the broken fence and the cattle she had not yet counted, that she would not borrow against the land. It was the one thing she had promised herself in the absence of any witness. She picked up the notebook and rode over to Dora's in the dark. Dora heard the whole of it at her kitchen table with her hands around a coffee cup and her face attentive and still. When Bo was finished, Dora asked 2 questions. She asked whether Bo intended to stay. Bo said she did. Dora said the credit merchants in Miles City charged rates that would swallow a person, and that Walt Greer was honest about his terms, even if he was not encouraging about her prospects, and that if she was going to borrow $180 against the deed, it was better to borrow it from a man who kept his ledger straight. Bo went back to Walt Greer's the following week. Walt listened to the whole account, the same way he had listened to her establish her credit in June, with his hands flat on the counter and his expression attentive and unreadable. When she finished, he looked at the deed and then at her and asked her what she intended to do when the winter broke the herd. She told him she intended to have a full herd in March, He was quiet for what felt like a considerable time. Then he wrote $180 against her account, noted the deed as surety, and told her that if she defaulted, he would take the deed, and she would have nothing, and that he wanted her to know that plainly before she signed. She signed. She rode home on Pepper through the late August heat and pulled her uncle's warning letter from her breast pocket and read it sitting on Pepper's back while he walked, which he bore with his customary patience. She read the part about the hay short and the herd thin and what Clem had advised she do. She folded the letter and put it back. She had not sold. She had borrowed instead. Whether this was wiser or merely a different flavor of the same stubbornness, she could not have said. What she could say was that the winter was coming regardless of what she thought about it, and that the cattle needed feeding, and the fence needed checking, and Pepper needed his evening measure of grain, and that she could think about whether she had been a fool after she had done those things. September came cold and fast, the way Dora had told her it would. The first frost arrived on the 12th, which was 2 weeks earlier than Clem's almanac suggested, but consistent, Dora said, with what she had seen in the 4 years she had been running her own section. Bo moved the herd down from the upper pasture in mid-September and into the sheltered lower field, checked every section of the water trough for leaks, laid in the supplemental grain she had ordered from Walt's account, and cut a second run of the upper pasture grass before the cold closed it down entirely. She added the second cut to the hay barn and found herself with enough to cover a hard winter if the cattle cooperated and the storm did not run too long. October passed in the particular gray quiet of a Montana Territory fall. The creek began to freeze at its edges in the first week of November. Dora came over on the 10th to help Bo check the north fence a final time before the weather closed the opportunity, and the two women walked the line together through the cold afternoon, pulling on the wire and resetting the posts that had shifted with the ground. It was the kind of work that requires no conversation and produces it anyway. And by the time they finished, Bo knew 3 things about Dora she had not known before, including the fact that Dora had grown up in Illinois working her father's dairy and had come west with Harlan because he had been certain that Montana was a place a person could own a future, and that she had decided after Harlan died to find out whether he had been right. On the 14th of November, the ice storm arrived. It came out of the northwest in the early morning, a thick gray wall of cloud that Bo saw from the barn, where she had gone to give Pepper his grain. The temperature had been dropping since midnight, and by the time she was back inside the cabin, the wind had shifted and the sleet had started. By noon, the sleet was freezing on contact, coating every surface with a clear skin of ice that accumulated through the afternoon into something thick and heavy and impassable. The cattle in the lower field were restless, pressing against the south fence, which Bo read correctly as a sign that they wanted to move and had nowhere to go that was better. By evening, the ice was 4 inches thick on every flat surface, and the temperature was something below where her thermometer could reliably read. She fed the cattle what she could carry from the barn, wedged the barn door shut against the wind, and went inside the cabin and sat by the stove listening to the sound the storm made against the log walls, which was the sound of a thing that has no opinion about you and no interest in your plans. She was up before dawn on the second morning. The storm had not broken. The ice on the creek, which she could see from the cabin window, had thickened overnight, and the cattle were pressed against the fence in a solid mass, lowing with a low, persistent sound that carried through the wind. She counted them from the window. 51, all present, all cold but standing. She knew what she needed to do, and she did not spend any time arguing with herself about it. The shelter pasture was approximately 2 miles across the frozen creek, in a hollow of land to the south and west, where the ridge broke the worst of the northwest wind and the ground stayed a degree or 2 warmer than the valley floor. Clem had mentioned it in the almanac notes as the emergency pasture. She had never moved the cattle there, but she had ridden out to look at it in September and knew the fence was intact and the grass under the snow was reasonable. She saddled Pepper in the dark, moving by feel and lantern. He stood for the saddling without complaint, though the ice on his back required a moment's careful work with a rag before the saddle blanket would lay flat. She put on every piece of heavy wool she owned, tied a scarf around the lower half of her face, and told Pepper in the clearest terms she could that this was not a morning for opinions. She opened the gate and moved the cattle out. Agnes, the old roan cow, went first. The rest followed, stepping carefully on the ice, their hooves clicking and sliding on the frozen ground. Bo rode behind them, and Pepper moved steadily behind the herd, his breath rising in dense white clouds in the dark, his hooves finding purchase on the ice with a careful economy of motion that she noticed and was grateful for. The sleet hit her face and froze on her scarf and on the brim of her hat, and the cold was a weight that pressed against every exposed inch of her. But she kept the herd moving, and Pepper kept moving, and the cattle went where Agnes went. The creek crossing was the worst of it. The ice was solid under a fresh coat of sleet, and the cattle balked at the crossing for 10 minutes before Agnes walked out onto it, and the rest followed. Pepper crossed last, picking his way with his ears back and his attention absolutely forward, and she stayed quiet on his back and let him choose his footing. They were halfway across the valley toward the shelter pasture when she saw the lantern. Dora was on horseback at the edge of the shelter pasture fence, holding a lantern up at arm's length in the dark and the sleet, wearing the same heavy canvas coat Bo had seen her repair on her porch in October. She had ridden out in the storm without being asked, on the same logic that had sent Bo out before dawn, which was that the cattle needed to be moved and that 2 people could hold a herd in a shelter pasture through 3 days of ice better than 1. They did not speak over the wind. They got the herd through the gate, pulled it shut, and held the cattle through the rest of the morning, riding the perimeter of the shelter pasture in slow turns while the ice storm pressed down on the valley and the cattle settled into the hollow's relative warmth. They took turns going into the small lean-to shed at the edge of the pasture to get out of the wind for 15 minutes, warming their hands over a small fire Dora had built before Bo arrived, and then going back out. On the 3rd day, the storm broke. The temperature rose over the course of the morning, and by afternoon the ice was thinning on the flat ground, and the creek was audible again, moving under a skin of ice that would not last the week. Bo and Dora moved the cattle back across the valley that evening in the last gray light, and the herd went without trouble. 51 head, all accounted for, all standing on their own feet. Bo did not lose a single animal. She sat at Dora's kitchen table that night, eating a plate of beans and cornbread, and discovered that she had lost feeling in the last 2 fingers of her left hand, which Dora addressed with warm water and steady attention, and the particular matter-of-fact manner of a woman who has treated her own cold injuries more than once. The feeling came back by midnight, which was a relief, though her hands would carry a faint ache in cold weather for years afterward. The winter held, and the cattle held with it. March arrived in the way that March arrives in Montana Territory, which is to say not so much as a season but as a series of days that gradually remember what warmth is. By the middle of the month, the lower field was showing the first pale green of new grass, and the creek was fully open and running clear over the stones. On the 20th of March, 1884, Bo rode Pepper into town. She had the $180 in a cloth envelope in her coat pocket, beside Clem's warning letter. She had tallied the feed supplement costs through the winter against what Walt's account had recorded, and the figure was exactly $180. She had sold 2 of the summer's hay surplus to a neighbor she had met in October, a taciturn wheat farmer named Blevins, and the $22 that Sale had brought in was what gave her the margin to close the debt in full rather than carry a portion forward. She tied Pepper at the post in front of Walt's feed merchants and went inside. Walt was behind the counter with his hands flat on the wood in his customary posture, talking to another man she did not know. When she came in, he looked up, and she saw something shift in his face, a quick, careful reading of her presence. Before his expression settled back into its usual reserve, she set the cloth envelope on the counter and told him she was paying the debt in full. He counted the $180 without comment, wrote the settlement in his ledger, and drew a line through her account balance. The other man in the store had stopped his conversation and was watching from the far end of the counter. Walt closed the ledger. He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded. It was a single, deliberate nod, the kind a person offers when they have been wrong about something and find they cannot quite say so aloud, but will not pretend they haven't recognized it. He did not tell her to sell. He did not tell her anything. He picked up his pencil and made a note in his ledger, and she did not ask what it said. She thanked him, turned, and walked out. Pepper was at the post where she had left him, ice calm in the March wind. She untied him, swung up, and rode out of town at a pace that was not hurried. She smiled on the ride home. Not before. The word that got around Custer County in the spring and summer of 1884 was not dramatic, because true things rarely are. What people said was that the widow Holloway, which was what they called her despite the fact that she had never been married, had kept her herd through the November storm that had killed cattle on 4 other ranches in the valley, had paid her feed debt in full before the grass was up, and seemed to intend to stay. Walt Greer extended her credit for the following season without discussion. 2 other merchants in town whose names she did not know sent word through Walt that they were pleased to offer her accounts should she need them. She needed neither that year, which she thought Clem would have found satisfying. Reverend Amos Cole arrived in Custer County that summer on his regular circuit, a spare man with a long memory and a deep voice who came through twice a year and held services in whatever building was available and willing. He came out to Ridgeline Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon in July at Dora's invitation, drank coffee at Bo's pine table, and listened to the 2 women explain what they had been discussing since April. What they had been discussing was an informal arrangement between the 2 sections, hers and Dora's, a working partnership that made use of what each ranch did better than the other. Bo's lower meadow produced hay in volume. Dora's eastern section had the better shelter pasture and the steadier water supply from the creek tributary that ran through it. Between them they could share labor, share knowledge, and manage both herds through a Montana winter with considerably less risk than either could alone. Reverend Cole listened to all of it. He said it seemed to him a reasonable arrangement and that he would be glad to witness a written agreement between them if they had one. They did. Bo had drawn it up herself, in the same careful ledger hand she had used for 8 years of dry goods accounting in St. Louis. 4 pages, clear terms, no language that either party could misread. The Reverend read the whole thing slowly and said it was one of the tidiest contracts he had seen in a dozen years of frontier ministry. He witnessed it with his signature and the date, July 14th, 1884. The partnership held. It held through the winter of 1884 and the difficult spring of 1885, when the creek ran high and flooded the lower meadow for 3 weeks, and Bo and Dora spent the better part of a month moving cattle to higher ground and then moving them back. It held through the summer of 1886, when the hay came in heavier than any year she had seen, and she sold the surplus to 3 buyers in Miles City and paid forward a season of feed costs she did not yet owe. It held through the long winter of 1887, which was bad across the whole of the northern plains, with cold that settled in October and did not properly lift until April, and which killed cattle on ranches far better provisioned than hers. She lost 4 head that winter, the first losses she had taken, and she noted them in her ledger and put her hand on Pepper's neck for a moment in the barn, and then went back inside and did the arithmetic on what spring would require. She sent Clem's almanac back to his shelf above the stove. She had her own notes by then. The years accumulated the way years do on working land, without ceremony and without pause, each one measured in what the hay yield came to, and what the herd count stood at after winter, and what the fence needed in April. The herd grew. She kept careful records of the breeding seasons, and culled the line with a rigor that Dora told her approvingly was the same care Harlan had never quite managed. By 1890, the herd stood at 78 head, the most it had ever been, and the 320 acres were better fenced and better watered than at any time in Clem's tenure. She had added a second shelf to the cabin wall and filled it with books she ordered from a catalog supplier in Chicago. Not the almanac kind, but the kind she had wanted since she was 12 years old, and Nobody's ledger clerk, natural history, surveying, a collected volume of geology that she read through twice and kept at the end of the shelf nearest the stove. Walt Greer retired in 1891 and sold the feed merchants to his nephew, a thin man with a quick manner named Cade, who ran the accounts differently and, in Beau's view, less accurately. She did her business there anyway, and corrected the invoices when they were wrong, which Cade eventually accepted as a feature of the arrangement rather than a criticism of his methods. Walt, in the 2 years between his retirement and his death in 1893, had the habit of stopping by the Ridgeline Ranch on his way out of town whenever he had occasion to pass. He would tie his horse and come in and sit at the pine table and drink coffee and say, "Very little," which was consistent with his whole character. But he would look around the cabin and the barn and the hay stacked in the field with an expression that Beau had privately decided was as close as Walt Greer was ever going to get to an apology, and she was content with it. He came by 11 times in those 2 years. She kept count. Dora was there for most of them because by 1891 the informal arrangement had become something more natural than an arrangement. The kind of partnership that stops being a formal thing and simply becomes the way 2 people live. They ate together most evenings, worked both sections as a single unit through every hay and calving season, and spent the winter nights at whichever cabin had the better fire, which alternated by an unspoken logic that neither of them ever needed to name. The question of what to call it was never a question they raised, because the valley did not offer them a name and they did not need one. Reverend Cole, who saw it plain enough, kept his own counsel and asked no questions. Beau read Clem's warning letter to Dora for the first time in the winter of 1895, sitting by the stove on a January evening with the snow laid thick across both sections and the cattle wintered in the shelter pasture without incident and nothing demanding to be done at that particular moment. She had carried the letter in her coat pocket for 12 years by then, a habit so ordinary that she had stopped noticing the weight of it. She read it aloud in Clem's careful, deliberate hand, the 60 head, and the mild winter provision, and the sell before the freeze advice. And when she reached the end, Dora was quiet for a moment, and then said that Clem had known her well enough to know she would not take the advice, and that he had probably written it because he needed to say it, even though he already knew how it was going to go. Beau looked at the letter for a moment. She said that was probably right. Then she laughed. It was a plain, easy laugh, the kind that carries no performance in it. And Dora laughed too, and the fire burned and the snow pressed down on the valley outside, and neither of them said anything else about it that needed to be said. If you have ever held on to a warning long enough to laugh at it, you know something about how a life becomes itself. The years after that moved in a different register, slower and more certain, the way things move when the question has been answered, and what remains is only the living of it. The herd plateaued in the mid-80s of head count through the late 1890s, steady and healthy, and Bo added a proper second room to the cabin in 1898 using timber she and Dora cut from the upper ridge and milled in Miles City, which gave her a bedroom separate from the main room for the first time in 15 years on the property. She put Clem's 3 tins of salt, baking soda, and dried sage on the shelf in the new room because she liked the smell. Pepper died in the summer of 1901 in the small paddock beside the barn where he had spent his retirement from regular riding, and she buried him at the edge of the north fence line where the ground was soft and the view of the valley was the best of any spot on the 320 acres. She hung his bridle on a nail inside the barn door where it stayed. She bought a younger mule the following spring, a bay with a rounder face and a more sociable manner, whom she named Clement, which Dora said was sentimental and Bo said was accurate. The county had changed around them by then, filling in with families and small towns and the slow institutional weight of a territory that had become a state in 1889 and was still figuring out what that meant. The circuit preachers became less circuit and more settled. The feed merchant accounts became less personal and more formal. The cattle market fluctuated in ways that required her to read the Miles City Yellowstone Journal and the agricultural bulletins that arrived twice a year, and she read them with the same attention she had brought to every other thing the land required of her. She and Dora watched 2 generations of their neighbors struggle, and some of them fail, and most of them manage, and they helped when they were asked, and sometimes when they were not asked, in the practical ways the land had taught them. A half-ton of hay sent across a fence after a neighbor's bad year. A fence repaired on a section belonging to a widow with a sick child. A count taken of a herd nobody was well enough to count. They did not announce any of this because the valley did not require announcement and because the work was the point. Reverend Cole's successor, a younger man named Harbert, who came through in the early 1900s, and stayed longer than any circuit preacher Bo had known, told her once that the Ridgeline section and the Voss section together were the steadiest ground in the county, and that she should know people said so. She thanked him and asked whether he wanted more coffee. She ranched the Ridgeline 320 acres for 34 years. When she died in the spring of 1917, in the same cabin where she had eaten biscuits on her first night and read the almanac by lamplight, she was 66 years old and had outlived her warning by 34 full years and had kept every acre and increased the herd from 51 to a count that her estate ledger recorded at 93 head on the day the neighbors came to help. Dora outlived her by 4 years. She managed both sections in those 4 years with the help of a hired man she had worked with since 1907, and she sold nothing. They buried Bo on the hill above the cabin, on the south-facing slope where the view ran the full length of the valley and the mountains showed clear on a fair day. Dora stood at the grave in the spring wind without speaking, which was consistent with her whole character, and Reverend Harbert said the words, and the neighbors who had come stood in the cold and listened. Dora had carried Clem's warning letter in her own coat pocket for the last year of Bo's life, keeping it safe for her when Bo's hands made the careful extraction difficult. She put it back in Bo's coat before they closed the box. She thought Clem would have wanted it there. She thought Bo would have too. The bridle still hung on the nail inside the barn door when the estate was settled. The 3 small tins of salt, baking soda, and dried sage were still on the shelf in the back room, and the dried sage still smelled of the valley when someone lifted the lid. The spring grass was coming in across the lower meadow the morning they buried her, pale and new at the roots, pushing up through the places where the frost had softened overnight, 320 acres of it running down from the ridge to the creek, steady and unhurried, exactly as it had been every spring for 34 years. If a thing needed doing, she did it. Everything else could wait. There are stories like hers all through that country, if you know how to look for them. Stories of people who were told plainly what they could not manage and managed it anyway, through nothing more and nothing less than showing up every morning and doing the work. If you know a story like that, one that belongs to your part of the country or your own family, leave it in the comments below. These stories deserve to be remembered. And if you want another one, we have the story of a woman who rode into a Wyoming drought year with a deed, a borrowed wagon, and $37, and the valley that watched her come and could not believe what she built.